Okay, so we're ready to start our second lecture on ecosystems. Last time we spent a bit of time looking at the role of climate in determining, what kind of temperature and precipitation you're going to have in an area, and some of the different mechanisms that go into regulating our temperature here on the Earth. We had left off when we were discussing how heat can be moved around in the atmosphere and therefore the biosphere by different air, wind, water currents. So now we're ready to take a little bit closer look at the idea of an ecosystem. An ecosystem has both biotic and abiotic factors. So biotic are living factors, like biology is the study of life. Abiotic means something without life. So biological influences on an ecosystem would mean that things that living things need, or living factors. So predation would be a good example. If I'm a rabbit and I've got foxes preying on me, that's a biological influence on an organism. The amount of vegetation an area has would definitely influence all the organisms in an ecosystem. But not everything that influences organisms, whether that be food availability or shelter or something like that, is alive. Some of it is not alive, and those are abiotic factors. For example, we just got done talking about climate, and so climate is absolutely going to affect living things in an ecosystem. If you have a low average temperature, you're going to have very different organisms than if you have a high average temperature. We've mentioned water multiple times. Deserts are dry. That's the one thing that makes them a desert, is not having enough water. So that influences the total amount of primary productivity. So we see that these non-living factors, whether it's the amount of water you have, your temperature, your nutrient availability. Remember, we talked about ideas of limiting nutrients, that if you don't have enough of something, it will limit your total productivity. That those abiotic or non-living factors will shape an ecosystem, and that will then determine what kind of organisms and how many of those organisms can live in a particular area. So we want to take a look at both some different biotic factors today and some abiotic factors. So one of the first biotic factors is habitat. So you've heard that term habitat before. This is an area where an organism lives. Now, it's not just as simple as, I live in a hole in the ground if I'm a rabbit or something like that. It includes both your biotic and abiotic factors together. So if you're a rabbit, you're going to need to have, supplies of food. So you need particular types of vegetation to eat. You can't eat in every single plant, but there are some that are definitely beneficial to you. You're going to need certain temperatures and certain amounts of water, and those certain amounts of water that you need will probably support the type of plants you need as well. So these two things become really super tied together, in that the biotic and abiotic factors have to mesh just right for you to get the habitat you need. If you're a fish, you need other things to eat, whether that's algae if you're a herbivore, or other fish to eat if you're a carnivore. And you're going to need the right kind of water at the right temperature with the right amount of oxygen dissolved in it. And that will then influence where fish live and where they don't live. Right? Along with the idea of a habitat is something called a niche, or some people call it a niche. This is an organism's role in its ecosystem. So if you're that rabbit and you've got that habitat you need with those living and non-living factors, then you can live and do your rabbit thing. When you're doing that, it means that you are in your niche. That is, you have that rabbit in an ecosystem has a role. Okay, its role is to, live in burrows and go out and eat little bits of vegetation, have lots of rabbit babies, and then probably get eaten by something else at some point. All of those together create the idea of a niche, and that each organism has its own, I should say, species. Each population in an area, in an ecosystem, has its own unique niche. Probably a good way of thinking of this is like a job description. So, a job description, if you take some of our organisms we use for our food web, you could make job descriptions for each one, where they live, what they eat, what eats them, how often they eat, how do they help cycle energy or nutrients in an ecosystem, how much energy they use in an ecosystem. All of those collectively describe niche. And so when we were talking about changing our food web, if we think about changing a food web and how you can add or take away like a tertiary level consumer, that will then not having somebody doing their job in an ecosystem will then affect the ecosystem. If you don't have that top predator who's there to like keep the large herbivores in check, then those large herbivores will, eat more than they should. And so, it's a big part of an organism's role is to influence the ecosystem around it. And ideally, every organism does its job, and that keeps that ecosystem functioning really good. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. Keep that idea of a niche in mind. Let's take a look at some different community interactions. That is, how do different populations in an ecosystem start to interact with each other, and how does that influence their that total ecosystem and their populations? So let me give you an example here. So these are two species of anoles. They're a type of lizard, a subtropical lizard. And we've got this lizard, this anole that perches on fences, and then this anole perches on shady branches. Now, the interesting thing is that there's actually multiple species of anoles in some location. As you can see, there's like 7 or so right here. And the interesting thing is that all these species really pretty much eat the same sort of thing. They all eat insects. And so why is the question, why do they some spend their time up in the top of the trees, some spend their time on shady branches, some spend their time out in the sun, some live on the ground, some don't. Why is that? That's a good question. If they all eat the same thing. Well, this is to help with their community interactions. These are different populations. They don't interbreed, even though they're really, really similar. And the idea here is if you had a job to do and somebody else had to do the exact same job, you'd kind of be competing against one another to do that one single job. It's like in California, Missouri, lots of places sell hamburgers. So the competition to sell a hamburger is really high. So places try to do things differently in order to make their hamburger and what else they can do more desirable. If every restaurant served exactly the same thing, then there would be so much competition between them. But if they serve different things, then you will get something different. For example, here in town, McDonald's is your standard hamburger, fries types of thing. What can you get at McDonald's you can't get anywhere else? I don't know. I don't go to McDonald's. Maybe you could get some of their some of the drinks they have. They might have somewhere else. If you go to Burger Haus, they've got burgers and fries just like McDonald's right across the street, but they have a buffet, which not very many places in town have. So that then is beneficial to them to have something different so they don't compete so much. You could take The Grind, which serves specialized coffee and stuff like that. Yes, a lot of other places serve coffee. They just serve a different sort. So that lowers the competition. That's kind of like all these different animals. So there would be a ton of competition, two organisms trying to use the same resource at the same time. Like in the case of us trying to get a hamburger or those animals trying to get something to eat. If they were all in the same place, all those species trying to eat the same bugs at the same time, there would be tons of competition and it would be detrimental to them. So that leads us to something called the competitive exclusion principle, a really nice term here that I just skipped. It says no two species can occupy the same niche at the same time. So if we had these lizards all trying to live in the same place at the same time, they would exclude one another. So by separating out and focusing on slightly different niches here, I live in different places, even though I, prey on the same type of thing, that then allows them to minimize their competition so they don't put each other out of business. Like that's what would happen if somebody showed up in town with a new restaurant that only served hamburgers and fries, they would go out of business. They have to have something different so they don't compete so much. So that's the idea when you start looking at organisms in their niches in an ecosystem. You start to think, well, these two things are really similar. How much do they compete? How much do their niches overlap? Because the more they overlap and the more you have the similar job description, the more competition you're going to have between the two of them. A really great example of this is a hawk and an owl. They both are birds of prey. They fly around, they catch small rodents, and eat the exact same thing. Okay, so why do we get to have both hawks and owls? Well, their niches are different because owls only come out at night and prey on things that come out at night. Hawks are out in the day, they only prey on things that come out in the day. That's enough to separate their niches that there's not enough of an overlap that it excludes one or the other of them. Now, do they compete? Absolutely. They'll both eat rabbits, let's say. But the competition is not enough to totally exclude one population or the other. Now, this gets into a problem. We talked and maybe mentioned about an invasive species. If a new organism is introduced into your food web or into nature, if it outcompetes, if it has a niche that overlaps a lot with a native species and it can outcompete it, then that's going to exclude the native species. Another pressure that exists in a community is predation. This is just simply when one organism feeds on another, and here we have a dragonfly that is preying on a housefly, it looks like. We're pretty familiar with this when we talked about food chains and food webs. This is just a transfer of energy that's occurring in our ecosystem. Okay, now we're ready to look at some different symbiotic relationships. So symbiotic relationships are relationships where two things live together. All right, we're going to look at three different types of symbiotic relationships. Okay, these are instances where organisms are living really close together, and that then creates some sort of relationship between them. Okay, the first symbiotic relationship is mutualism. This is a relationship where both species benefit. Great example, insects and pollination. So the butterfly gets a free meal. What does the plant get in return? They get themselves pollinated, and it helps to move their pollen around so they can successfully reproduce. They depend on one another at this point, so it is a mutually beneficial relationship. Some ants will actually herd and take care of aphids. So these are little bugs that suck juice out of plants. The ants kind of take care of them like a shepherd with their sheep, which is kind of weird. You can see those around here occasionally. But what do the ants get out of it? Well, whenever they stroke or touch the back of one of these aphids, it will secrete some of the fluid that it's been sucking out of the plant. So the ant gets like a sweet meal from this, because that ant can't suck those plant juices out. And so it gets a good meal. In return, these aphids are protected by the ants. Those ants will protect aphids from lots of predators. So much like shepherds and sheep, it's kind of a mutually beneficial relationship. Okay, they both get some sort of benefit from this. Commensalism is another symbiotic relationship where one species benefits, but the other really isn't harmed nor helped. So we've got a clownfish living in his anemone. So Nemo here, what does he get out of it? Well, anemones have stinging cells, and so they get super protected here from these. And then they can go out and find stuff to eat and come back and hide in their anemone. What does the anemone get out of it? Well, we don't know necessarily everything that an anemone we're gonna maybe can say it. We don't know everything they get out of this. Barnacles on a whale. Maybe those barnacles growing on the side of a whale don't really hurt it or help it. But it does benefit the barnacle. It doesn't necessarily benefit or hurt the whale. So commensalism just means something's living on something else, like a lichen living on a tree. Benefits the lichen, the tree doesn't really care one way or another. It doesn't help it, doesn't hurt it. Maybe remoras swimming alongside a shark. The shark eats something, some little bits fall down, and the remora gets a free meal. It doesn't help the shark, it doesn't hurt the shark. Parasitism is probably the one we're most familiar with. This is a symbiotic relationship where one organism benefits and the other is distinctly harmed. So ticks, fleas, worms, parasites like this head louse right here. This guy gets a free meal while it does harm its host. A lot of parasites transmit diseases. They don't want to kill their host, but they do want to be able to live off of them and get free meals and or reproduction, place to reproduce or whatever. So parasites we generally see as not good, at least on us. However, they are just a very normal part of nature, for better or for worse. And it is symbiotic because it is living with someone for a period of time. Now, a mosquito biting you is not parasitism, right? That's a one-time event. They don't live with you like a tick would live on you for a period of time, or lice would live on you as long as they could. But a mosquito gets one blood meal and then leaves. It's not going to come back for more. So that's an example of predation, not parasitism. All right. We will stop there for now, and we'll catch back up next time.